The people and places of the Caribbean region, we are all unique. But there are some things we all share, like hopes for a bright future for our children, and the beauty of our ocean treasures. The king of the ocean is the great whale. Some Caribbean countries see whales year-round. Others rarely see them. But make no mistake, they're all around us. Many countries are starting to realize that whales can be a vital part of their tourism industry. Yet, we still know very little about them. How many are there? What do they do while they're here? Where do they go? What we do know is that whales face many dangers. They become entangled in nets and die. They strand themselves on our beaches for unknown reasons. They are struck by boat propellers and are injured or die. They're killed by the thousands in other parts of the world, where the industrial approach to hunting ensures that the animal cannot be taken humanely. And since whales travel great distances, the whales hunted elsewhere may be the same ones that spend time with us in the Caribbean and are important for tour and dive operators. The debate about whales and whaling has come to the Caribbean. Our destiny, our resources, our whales, their welfare are all tied together. We must have an open discussion about how we as a region address these complex issues, whaling in our waters.
With regard to our interest in the whaling issue, it was even simpler. We became interested because the position our government seems to be espousing runs contrary to what we were taught in school, in our environmental studies classes. We're taught that many of the whale species were hunted close to extinction in the pre-fossil fuel era. We're taught that dwindling whale stocks caused governments to come together to fashion a regime for the conservation and management of whale stocks, and hence the International Whaling Commission was born in 1946. We're taught that the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, sets quotas for nations to conduct commercial whaling in 1975, but they had to revise this and put a ban on all commercial whaling.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of whales have been killed in the commercial whaling vessels, by the commercial whaling vessels. They are nowhere near their historic levels, and in fact several species were hunted to near extinction and some stocks were wiped out. So for anybody today to argue that there are too many whales out there or that there are a lot of whales out there don't understand what happened historically in the whaling industry. They don't understand how many whales were killed.
The government has prostituted itself for money. It has accepted Japanese money in exchange for voting the way the Japanese want them to vote. And the brothels are from here going south and from here going north. Nearly all of the Eastern Caribbean states have sold out to the Japanese, and there's no argument that it was done for anything other than money.
Contrary to a belief in certain quarters, Antigua and Barbuda has not surrendered its sovereign rights or entitlements to its exclusive economic zone within its territorial waters.
The government of Japan willingly met the needs of this project for construction of Fisheries Development Center in Antigua and Barbuda, and so granted the provisional cost to the sum of approximately $8,500,000 US.
We have not bartered our vote at the International Whaling Commission.
I am not saying that the UK or the anti-whalers have all the evidence, but at least we acknowledge that we don't have, and that we believe that more research needs to be done so that we know what we're doing. If you kill all the whales in order to allow more fish to survive, and you then fish more extensively, you kill not only the whales, but the fish. Nothing is left. Man is sometimes as stupid as that. Are we really going to be so simplistic in our approach that we believe killing whales will mean more fish? It won't, unless man learns how to live with nature and does not exploit it as we continue to do.
The Antigua and Barbuda Independent Tourism Promotion Corporation, known as ABITPC, is an environmentally oriented volunteer lobbying group based in Antigua and Barbuda. ABITPC was formed in 2001 to identify problems in the tourism sector. One of its major projects was a beautification campaign called Make Antigua and Barbuda Shine. More than 11,000 people participated. Martha Watkins Gilkes is the public relations officer of this nonprofit organization, which is also very concerned about the marine environment. ABITPC's concern led to a public forum on whaling, co-hosted by Antigua and Barbuda's Environmental Awareness Group.
ABITPC took a strong stand against the captive dolphin facility when it first opened in 2001 in Antigua. And there's been a lot of debate lately in Antigua about captive dolphins and about the whaling issue. And that particular topic led to ABITPC recently establishing a public opinion table for people to voice their opinion. Nobody's really asked Antiguans, how do you feel about it, or given them a chance to say yes or no. So ABITPC launched a whaling opinion table.
We want to support a dialogue and a scientific approach to whaling and what man is doing to nature. And do we know enough, I think, is the real question. Are we really sure about what we're doing?
I'm a marine mammal biologist, and I've studied whales and dolphins and seals and sea lions in the wild as a graduate student, and then I've been working in policy and protection issues since 1993. I work for the Humane Society of the United States and Humane Society International, and I've traveled to quite a few places around the world, as well as working in the United States to improve protection for marine mammals.
The scientific whaling program of Japan has been heavily criticized by scientists. They will tell you that it is endorsed by the IWC. That is spin of just fantastic proportions, because in fact no such endorsement has ever occurred by anybody but the whaling nation. So the anti-whaling nations, which still hold a majority, definitely do not endorse the scientific whaling program. In a paper authored by scientists representing a majority of the delegations at the IWC, and the paper references at the bottom in tiny, tiny print, the author stated, "Just how bad does science have to be before its quality ceases to be a matter of opinion?" In other words, the Japanese scientific whaling program is so bad, and its science is so bad, and its publications are so bad, that really it isn't science. You know, they don't even get published in most normal journals. They have to only publish in Japanese journals because nobody in the international community will publish their work. Many IWC members have contended that Japan's scientific whaling program is so poor that it would not survive review by any independent funding agency. In other words, the government pays for this whaling program. It would never get a grant from anybody who, is independent. So the scientific permits that they issue, the Japanese issue, that they are doing under what I will call a loophole of scientific whaling at the IWC. They currently hunt minke whales in the North Pacific. This is the JARPN, JARPN stands for the Pacific in the North, Japanese research program in the North Pacific. They take 100 common minke whales. They take 50 sei whales since 2003. That was when they first expanded the program. 50 Brutus whales, that's pronounced Brutus, and 10 sperm whales. All of this in the name of science. They actually argue that one of the scientific reasons they started taking the larger Sei and Brutus whales, because common minke whales are only about 35 feet long, Sei and Brutus whales are more like 50 feet long, was to study methods of processing them at sea. They hadn't done it in so many years that they had to find out if they could still do it. And that was a scientific reason. Can we cut them up and turn them into steaks at sea efficiently? The sperm whales, it's an interesting situation there because nobody really likes sperm whale meat. So really these animals are basically processed into fertilizer and that sort of thing. JARPIN 2 begins in this next season. They just finished JARPIN 1, which was a 16-year program. And without evaluating the 16 years of results, they just went right into JARPIN 2, which no good scientist would do. They are now going to add fin and humpback whales to this program. Both of these species are considered endangered. And the humpback whales that they're going to be hunting down in the Antarctic are the same ones that are identified and studied by behavioral researchers and watched by tourists in countries such as Australia. So basically, all of these humpback whales, which as you know from your familiarity with them here in the Caribbean, are individually identifiable by the markings on their tails, and people give them names. They're going to be killing them now in the Antarctic, and so Australia, as you can imagine, is a little bit upset about this. They also hunt approximately 440 Antarctic minke whales, which is a different species in the Southern Ocean. And that's JARPA, which is the Japanese research program for the Antarctic. In 1994, the International Whaling Commission made the Southern Ocean a whale sanctuary. So it's a sanctuary which is supposed to keep them safe from hunting, and yet the Japanese are killing 440 minke whales, and now they're going to be killing fin and humpback whales there. Whether there's a moratorium or not, which there is at the moment, they're not supposed to hunt there. And yet they do. Now they claim it's because the sanctuary is only supposed to protect them from commercial whaling, but in fact, it doesn't make any sense in a sanctuary to allow any killing at all. A principal aim of JARPA and JARPIN is to investigate the impact of whales on fisheries. This is one of their scientific justifications for the program, and it's one of the pieces of literature you'll find on the table. The Humane Society International, my organization, has made a special effort to look at this argument because it's very prevalent right now. It's something you may have heard here in the Caribbean. It's one of the ways they have tried to convince governments in the Caribbean to support their position on whaling. Basically, the argument is that whales eat so many commercially important fish species that they need to be culled. You really have to understand how many whales were killed during the heyday of commercial whaling to realize how incredibly absurd this argument is. Most whales were driven to the brink of extinction by the 1930s. Although minke whales were never hunted in large numbers, so they're probably the most healthy populations of whales out there. Nevertheless, fin whales, humpback whales, blue whales, Sei whales, Brutus whales, sperm whales were depleted to an enormous degree. In some cases, at one point they believed there might have only been about 100 blue whales left. Now this is back, this is from perhaps 250,000 or 500,000 when they were out there. So how in the world can whales now be so numerous that they're eating all of our fish? When we have factory trawlers out there with 80-mile-long long lines and, basically we're vacuum cleaning the oceans of fish, but we're blaming whales for declining fish stocks. And I'm not kidding you, it's that absurd. That's what they're saying. They're claiming they're studying the impact on fish stocks by looking at stomach contents, which they only can do if they kill them, and by employing ecosystem models that are so simplistic that I will say bluntly, real scientists, just laugh at their models. They're just absurd. And again, they can't get their papers published in any international journals. This is a map that you'll find in the document on the table there that's called Food for Thought. It was a study that we supported. Researchers at the Sea Around Us Project, which is a fisheries research consortium. They're really interested in how fisheries are doing. But they're trying to look at this situation of how predators of fish are interacting with fisheries. And so they looked at the overlap between marine mammal distribution and commercial fisheries, and they found that, in fact, that overlap is quite low. The bright red are the only places where commercial fisheries overlap to any extent with marine mammal distribution. The pink areas, those are fisheries with almost no marine mammal overlap. It's not that marine mammals aren't there, it's that there's just not a lot of them anymore, because we killed them all. And even in those hot spots, in the red areas, you notice there's quite a lot of red around Japan, in fact. It doesn't necessarily mean that the marine mammals that are there are eating the commercially important fish. It just means they exist at the same place the fishery does, but it doesn't mean they're actually eating the fish that are captured in the fishery. That's what needs to be looked at further. If you've got a red area, you've got a hot spot, then you would need to look at that. But in fact, there are very few places where you even need to look at that. So basically, what it comes down to is that these are quotes from the researchers who did this report. The analysis clearly shows that there's no evidence that food competition is a global problem. Consequently, there's little basis to blame marine mammals for the crisis that fisheries are facing today. Obviously, the real problem is, the bulk of marine mammals, they occur in areas that have low overlap, but what marine mammals consume is largely stuff that we do not catch in areas where we do not fish. So that's what this study, using these maps, looking at marine mammal distribution, have discovered. But they basically don't eat what we eat. The basis of the food chain for whales is krill, which are these tiny crustaceans, these tiny shrimp-like crustaceans. And, that's not, important to us commercially. This, by the way, is a humpback calf that was killed in Bequia. Sorry. I'm going to leave most of this to John, but I just wanted to put these two quotes up here. Your government, a newsletter, mentioned that the 17 million fisheries grant from Japan was a direct result of its pro-whaling stance. In other words, they sold their vote. And in 2000, the Dominican Minister for Environment, Agriculture, and Fisheries said Japan announced that if they couldn't get Dominica to come along with them, they would have to place Dominican aid projects under review. It was a direct threat that they made. And as the Dominican minister said, if that's not extortion by the Japanese government, I don't know what is.
My name is John Fuller. I was the Whaling Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda to the International Whaling Commission between, it must have been between the mid-80s to the mid-90s. At that time, Antigua and Barbuda had adopted a pro-conservation stance at the IWC. And we voted generally for the preservation of the moratorium on commercial whaling. The government was quite strong in its position that we would continue adopting the pro-conservation stand at the IWC. We had been approached by the Japanese on several occasions. I met with some of them, and members of the Foreign Office here in Antigua met with them, and they dangled lures in front of us, which the Prime Minister at the time, Lester Bird, refused to accept. Antigua and Barbuda's involvement in the IWC started around 1980, when I knew nothing about it at the time. Apparently, a gentleman by the name of David McTaggart, Naomi probably knows the name, I bet you maybe nobody else here knows that name. You know him, Martin. He founded Greenpeace, and Greenpeace was one of the really strong NGOs that attended IWC year after year after year, trying and fighting and quarreling and kicking and biting and scratching and even bribing for protection of the world's environment. One of the most incredibly successful conservationists in the history of mankind. Fought hard, and in 1979, 1980, the NGOs, and the governments are always reactive. NGOs are proactive. Governments react to NGO pressure, to the people pressure. That's how it works, you know. That's how it works. And they realized that at the IWC that if there wasn't a moratorium, there was no hope for the big marine mammals of the world, and that would be the end of it, and hopefully some UFO would come down and take them away and take them to somewhere better, because they would die out. And so people like David McTaggart and other people, names you never heard of, names of men who died, gone, they approached Antigua and said, listen, this is the situation. This is what's going to happen. You're not a member of IWC. Join, we'll pay. We'll pay, and I'm telling you this now. And I don't care who records it. We'll pay. Greenpeace will pay. We'll pay your dues. We'll pay for the commissioner, but you got to vote to save the whales. And Antigua did. They joined. There was a commissioner, somebody not an Antiguan, some guy from somewhere. I don't know. I think he was a lawyer from Miami, who was our commissioner. But after about maybe 10 years of having, we didn't even know we had a commissioner at the IWC, did we? None of us knew. But they became more and more and more and more radical, and very strong complaints were filtered back through the European Union, back to Antigua, especially from Norway, of course. So the government decided he had to go, and they had to put someone else in who was more answerable. And so they appointed me for my sins. And we maintained a conservation stand. We scrimped and scraped to get money to pay our dues, and often we hadn't paid our dues and we weren't allowed to vote. We paid our own airline tickets. But it became a sort of a passion, because one found out that what was really happening was the exploitation of these great creatures was not going to stop, and that the Japanese and the Norwegians and the Icelanders and whoever else wanted to get in on the act were not going to stop. And the Japanese, the momentum of the Japanese government for whaling is unimaginable. You can't imagine the millions that the Japanese government will spend on whaling. You can't imagine it. And it's not really for anything that gives the Japanese people a lot of money, or even the Japanese government money. It's for national pride. Fine. And there's no long history of whaling in Japan. It's more or less the same as the rest of the world. Recent whaling, commercial whaling, European, Britain, USA, Russia, great whaling nations, Australia. But we have all come to the realization that the great whales of this earth were doomed. And without the protection that has been afforded them since 1981, they would have, the blue whale would have been gone, disappeared. The largest creature that ever came across the face of this planet, bigger than any dinosaur, it would have disappeared. There was a time when it was believed that a female and a male blue whale couldn't find each other to mate. They were so far apart. There were so few of them. The government held out, and the Japanese came and visited and made very subtle offers and very subtle offers. But when they realized that they were not going to succeed in getting the moratorium set aside, they started putting heavy pressure. And eventually they got the government here to sell out. One thing we didn't do, except we didn't have ministers of government going around making bogus speeches about sustainability of our resources and third world countries not being pushed around by first world countries, and that whales are eating our fish, or that we should start thinking about whaling. We didn't do that. Antigua was the last to hold out. Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica had already sold out to the Japanese a long time before we did. The Japanese basically were renting votes, renting us. They rent us. It's like rent a crowd, you rent a crowd to come and make a big demonstration, you pay everybody $100 to show up and they make a lot of noise and go away. Well, the Japanese have rented all of us in the Caribbean. And it's very, very, very sad. It's a scandal. Huh? It's a scandal internationally. The American public broadcasting system did a wonderful radio program about 3 or 4 years ago on it, and it was scandalous. But it went past. It goes right past everybody. It's so bad that the Japanese government has a public relations man in New York by the name of Alan McNow, who goes around throughout these little states like us and smaller states in the Pacific. They do it the same there, and they've now gone needling away at some African states to get them to come and vote at the IWC. Countries who have no interest in whaling, never had any interest in whaling, the Japanese are paying for them to come, join the IWC and come and vote for them. And they still haven't got the moratorium set aside. They have offered politicians prostitutes, all expenses, trips all over the world, and they're getting away with it. Now, if you will have seen what's happening down in the Point Wharf, it's quite a large complex they're building down there. I just can't understand what the hell they're building it for, because we don't have that sort of fishery here, you know. The Japanese have been starting to drop these little poison pills, you know. Think about imagine if you started whaling. Imagine if you, imagine the money you could be making. Imagine how the food you could be, your own food, you wouldn't have to spend all this foreign currency. Think about it, talk about it. Drop the idea in the newspaper here and there. In the Antigua Sun, you'll see 2-page ads, double-page ads. And it doesn't say who paid for them. Huh? You look and you'll see, I'm sure you've seen them where they say, the whales are killing your fish. Double-page ads, sometimes 4 pages in the Antigua Sun. Doesn't say who paid for them, doesn't say where they came from. Well, you don't have to think hard about it. This government inherited agreements made by the last government with the Japanese. But it's really sad to see how that they've not only inherited them, but this government is putting cream on them. And we have ministers of government like Joan Messiah, who's a good friend and a colleague, and a very good lawyer. But she goes out and makes political speeches about, you know, we don't want to be bullied by first world countries. We have the right to determine our own future, and we have the right to exploit our resources, and whales are one of our resources. It's done. The die has been cast. The Japs have bought us, and we have been paid. But I think it's very, very sad that we're not getting the education through to the children. Of course, we need to know that there is a certain amount of selling of our birthright in our agreement with the Japanese, and I think we need to have the issue publicly debated. We challenge them to come and justify what they're doing on a real basis, rather than basically selling our soul for a few dollars. If they come and say that, we'll say fine, okay, that's what you're doing. But don't come and try to justify it by saying you're doing a good thing and that it's in the interest of the state and the people and the rest of it.
Allow me to assure you that the government is unquestionably committed to managing our marine resources in a sustainable manner, to ensure that opportunities yet untapped are fully explored to yield meaningful economic rewards for our nation. This facility has bolstered our confidence in this regard, and hence our profound thanks must be given to the government and people of Japan, who have demonstrated in a most tangible way their commitment to assisting us in the development and management of our fisheries sector.
The government of Japan welcomes further opportunities to strengthen the bonds of friendship and cooperation with the government of Antigua and Barbuda in the spirit of goodwill and mutual respect.
even the most populous whale today, which is the minke whale, there are still healthy numbers of those. Even those are nowhere near their historic numbers because there's other things that are happening besides hunting. There's climate change, there's fishing that takes, I mean, when you think about it, a lot of people are saying the whales are eating our fish, and so we need to cull them, we need to control them. Look at it the other way. We're killing their fish, you know, in our industrial commercial fishing fleets. So we're in competition, there's no doubt about it, but we're just as likely to be taking all of their fish as they are to be taking ours. And other species of whales, like the humpback, like the blue whale, like the fin whale, they are at decimated numbers. There's no way on earth that they're competing for us, for fish.
There's a Japanese fishery complex. There's one that was built by them. It has about 5 boats in it. There's nothing in it that's working. It's pretty useless. It was built with Japanese money, of course, by Japanese. Most of the money went back to Japan. And it's useless. It's useless. There's another one in Parham that is even less useful than this one behind me. And of course, the first one in St. John's was basically they built a bus station. Had nothing to do with fisheries. They're now building this huge fisheries complex down in St. John's, which is it's going to end up like any of the other fisheries offices we've had. Unused. They'll probably move a discotheque into it eventually because it's useless. And the money is going back to Japan. If you go, you'll see Japanese workers, Japanese engineers, Japanese supervisors. It's ridiculous. Japanese engineers have engineered the project. Very little comes except the hard stuff that's left there. And in the end, it's not the sort of fishing we do in the Caribbean.
Another important aspect, particularly for Antigua and Barbuda or for the Caribbean, is tourism. It's a massive market here. And it's a market where whale watching is something that has been ignored, and I don't know why. Because whale watching increased from 4 million people to 9 million people in the past 10 years. It's an enormous market that's a very rich market. The spend increased from 77 million US dollars to 299 US dollars million, $299 million dollars. This is a tremendous area that can be exploited here and isn't, which I think is a great shame. Tourism is a fiercely competitive market. Many people coming here from the UK and from the States come here because they're looking for a green, friendly environment. They want sea, sunshine, of course, but they want an environment that they can relate to. Whales are a particularly important aspect of the UK's view of the environment. There is strong support for the UK government's anti-whaling stance. It may mean that people will consider where they go, perhaps not now in great numbers, but in the future, I am sure that people will consider whether they should holiday in places where whaling is something that is supported. They may not. They may vote with their feet. Individuals sometimes feel they can't make a difference, but an individual tourist thinks, I can actually make a difference, I cannot go. And this may well happen. Whether Japanese and Norwegian and other tourists will make up for the European and American tourists, I don't know. But I think it's something that this part of the world has to consider as a future threat, and I think it's a growing one.
Every year for the last 3 or 4 years, the Japanese, who are of course the ones pushing hardest for whaling, along with the Norwegians, who also have a commercial hunt, the Japanese have been pushing very hard to lift the moratorium on whaling. And every year for the last 5 or so years, they think they've had a majority and they never have managed to pull it off. Every year the pro-whale, anti-whaling forces sort of beat them back. So I'm thinking we're sort of playing a game of chicken and sort of exhausting both sides, but really maybe they should start thinking about, again, entering the 21st century instead of sort of hanging out in the 20th, and following a practice that's really incredibly, outdated.
As the populations become more and more educated, they will realize that pro-whaling is a thing of the past. And it's not something we want to do in the Caribbean. We don't want to kill whales.
Notwithstanding that we have few whales within our waters, like Japan, Antigua and Barbuda must of necessity concern itself with the sustainable use of its living marine resources. Antigua and Barbuda is duty-bound to protect and defend its territorial waters as fiercely as it would its right to harvest living marine resources in a responsible and sustainable manner. Antigua and Barbuda is a signatory to the CITES Convention. We recognize our legal, ethical, and moral duty and responsibility to ensure the sustainable replenishment and renewal of endangered species and those threatened by extinction. Our commitment and practices in this regard are unwavering.
If a government or a party sells out and justifies it by saying, oh, well, we'll get the building, but we've sold the vote, we've supported an idea which we don't really believe in, but we try to justify it by using all sorts of false logic, they'll sell out everything and anything else that is available. If you break a moral principle, for that, you're going to break every moral principle there is. You cannot oblige yourself legally in international law to vote a certain way at an international forum in exchange for money. In fact, it's a shame. It's a disgrace. And Lester Bird is the only one who ever came out of all the prime ministers and said, "Yes, I know. I'm doing it for the money. I'm doing it for the money." And he didn't hide it. So the others try to justify it by saying, oh, well, you know, the third world, we're third world people and we need to be able to chart our own course and use these, the resources or be in a position to use them if we need to, blah, 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 blah. Nonsense.
It is believed that Japan may have the numbers to take control of the International Whaling Commission. This would, however, need a 75% majority vote, which would see a total dismantling of all the conservation measures that have been passed over the last 20 years.